Hi, I'm Donna, and I blog at onceuponasewingmachine.com with my daughter, onceuponasewingmachine.com with my daughter Rachel. And today I'm going to show you how to add a bias binding to a raw edge. For today's example, we're going to use our peasant dress, either the flutter sleeve, which this one is, or the ruffle neck adaptation, which is the one that I'm going to sew today. Either way, the binding goes in the armhole, and we're going to show you a couple of different ways to add that to finish your armhole. The first thing that we're going to do is sew our side seams and finish the raw edges, which I already have done. For our purposes today, we are going to use bias tape single fold, and that'll give us a nice clean edge on the inside. I have measured my armholes and extended the end of the bias tape about 1 inch on each side. So that's about where you're going to want it to look. And obviously cut those lengths. The next thing I'm going to do is attach the bias. You're going to open up one fold and attach it right sides together, and we're going to stitch right along that fold line. Okay, so we're going to zoom in a little bit and see how we attach this. Remember, we measured about 1 inch past our top edge, so we're going to match it right sides together, and we're going to sew right in that inner fold line. So I'm just going to pin it there all the way around the armhole edge. I like to put my pins right on the fold. Then when I sew it, I'm going to sew on the fold and just remove my pins as I go. This is a curve, so in order to get a nice smooth curve, you're going to straighten out your curved armhole as well as you can. Push your seam allowance to one side. I have my seam allowance finished with a serger, so I'm just going to push the seam allowance to one side. If you are going to pink your seam allowance and press it open, then be sure your allowance is equally distributed or pressed open. And we're just going to pin all the way up to the top. And we'll have, this one's a little long. We've got a little more than 1 inch, but that's fine. No worries, as long as you've got a little extra, we're going to trim that when we're finished. I'm just going to sew this, maybe if my machine works, if I can find my pedal, right in the fold, removing the pins as you go. Be sure that you straighten out your rounded underarm edge so that you don't have any lumps and bumps in your underarm. Keeping the raw edges nice and even, you're just sewing along that fold line. So you can see that I've stitched all the way along the armhole edge in the curve, flattening it out as I go. Now we're going to cut our tails so that your bias binding is even with your raw edge. On this example, I am going to sew the bias binding to the inside of the garment. So you're attached there at the fold. You're simply going to turn it along the stitching line and pin it down. Once this is completely sewn down, you will have a nice clean finish on the wrong side of your garment and a nice smooth edge on the outside of your garment. when you're pinning this down, pin from the wrong side. It is going to be important that you are going to stitch right along the outside edge again of your bias binding. And you're going to want to be sure that your stitch length is adjusted and that you're sewing nice and smoothly, because you will see this stitching line on the right side of the garment. Again, you're going to fold your seam allowance. My seam allowance is serged, so I'm folding it to one side and straightening out that underarm edge as you go, because you don't want any lumps and bumps in there. So I pin it all the way to the other edge, and I'm going to sew in one continuous motion. I have now sewn my bindings to the wrong side of my garment in a nice straight stitch line around the curve of the armhole and up the other side. So on the finished side, on the right side of your garment, you have a nice looking fold. On the wrong side, you have no raw edge. In this application, we turned our bias binding to the wrong side so you don't see it. In this application, we turned our binding to the right side, so it adds a little extra trim. You can go to our website, onceuponasewingmachine.com, for further tutorials. Also, the peasant dress pattern is free in size 12 month through size 5 with multiple variations. You'll find the flutter sleeve, the ruffle collar, as well as multiple sleeve lengths.